Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this morning with us. It is both a privilege and a great responsibility, I think, to begin the panel sessions for today. I hope you enjoy what we have planned for you. We have a fantastic group who I will introduce in just a moment. In the meantime, I will offer just a few kind of maybe ground setting for this conversation. My name is Kirsten Eddy. I am a senior researcher at Pew Research Center, and we have a very simple and probably easy to probably determine by the end of this conversation question for everyone. In a changing information environment, what is news and who gets to decide? If you don't know what Pew Research Center is, we are a nonpartisan, non-advocacy research organization. We call ourselves a fact tank based in the United States. Our aim is to inform the public about the issues, attitudes, and trends shaping the world. And much of the research that I'll be talking about today comes from the Pew Night initiative, work that we are doing with the Knight Foundation, focused on civic information and engagement. One of the things that we've really been asking ourselves over the last couple of years, for a while we've been conducting public opinion polling and other research with Americans and people all over the globe to better understand news habits and attitudes. And when we do it, we've often asked people to sort of self-define news, figure out what it is to them, allow for the kind of range of perspectives and opinions. And for a long time, we thought we could sort of rely on a clear set of ideas around what that might entail, what that might mean to people. As the information environment gets more complex, I think we increasingly see that it's harder to answer that question. That answer becomes much more complicated for many people. So we sort of sought to better understand this. We conducted a range of work, both qualitative and quantitative. We did interviews with journalists and editors. We did a new qualitative method called an online discussion board with 57 US adults. And we also did nationally representative survey polling to better understand how people broadly were thinking about news from a range of different perspectives and approaches. I think if there's two things to kind of help set the stage for our conversation today that we really wanted to touch upon is first, that the journalists and editors we spoke with really kind of universally acknowledged that there has been a transfer of power in defining news. It has kind of moved from the traditional media gatekeeper to the general public who gets to decide what news is and what it means to them. The second piece is when we speak to the public, we see that defining news is both a personal and personalized experience nowadays. People make a range of decisions. They decide what news is on a sort of minute-by-minute basis based on a huge range of factors, including their own interests and identities. I'll touch on a few kind of key pieces from our research. I'll do my best to be quick so we can move straight into the conversation. But just to kind of lay some of the groundwork for what we found in some of this work and some of our other more recent work, one of the things that really came up when we asked sort of what makes something news to Americans, this is, I think, things that while we focus on the US public really apply on a global scale, and we can certainly discuss that in our conversation. When we ask whether things are a major factor, a minor factor, or not a factor at all in whether something does or does not count as news, we tend to see that a lot of the kind of traditional ideals that undergird a lot of the journalism field, the journalism industry, really kind of come through in people's perspectives about what news is. Whether it's factual, whether it's up to date, whether it's important, those things matter to people. They say that it matters to them when they're making these decisions. One of the things that really came through in our qualitative research was this idea of importance. Importance for some people can mean important to society. Someone says information that affects people on a larger scale and globally. Other people think about it as whether it is personally important, whether it is information that matters to them and affects their life on a daily basis. It's interesting because when we see this in our survey research, you can tell that alongside other potential factors, this idea of personal relevance kind of falls to the wayside. But we see a lot of tensions there between what people are saying here and what we see in our qualitative research, where when we actually ask people to define news for themselves, that idea really comes up often. Sometimes it's intertwined with societal importance. Those things are the same. What is personally important and what's societally important are one and the same. Other times, they're entirely divergent, and I think we can kind of discuss that as a group as we move forward. In terms of topics, we also see that a lot of what kind of the media industry as a whole has determined to be quote-unquote hard news remains what many people see as news. One of the things we really draw on here is a range of academic research that increasingly finds that people don't necessarily think of news as yes, it's news, no, it's not news, but rather look at it as a bit of a continuum. It can be more or less news-like depending on a huge range of things. Themselves, where and how they're getting information. And one of the things we see here when it comes to topics specifically is we see election updates, information about global conflicts. Those really rise to the top. People largely see those as definitely news. And then from the bottom, we can kind of see a lot of changes where we have a lot of kind of gray area. One of the things that I want to point out here is this idea of sports information. This is one that largely you will often hear people say, oh, that's not news, it's sports. If you're interested in sports, you will often think about it as news. One woman in her 60s who spoke with us said, I'm sure sports is news to a lot of people, just not me. And I feel like this really captures the actual acknowledgement that everyday people have, that something can be news to them and not news to someone else, and vice versa. People are very aware of the fact that they're making these decisions, and others may not share those perspectives. I want to kind of take just a couple minutes to focus on some of our broader social media research to kind of ground this conversation. One of the things that we see out yesterday, actually from Pew Research Center, on where Americans are getting news when it comes to platforms and social media, is when we look at actual users of each social media site, we see that more than half of US users who are on X or Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook are getting news there. Particularly striking is TikTok in this regard, where we see a massive increase in the proportion of its users who are seeing news regularly on that site. In the last 5 years alone. And so we can really see, obviously, this is not a surprise to anyone in this room, social media being an increasingly important element of the conversation when it comes to news consumption. We really wanted to hit that in this kind of big what is news question. So we actually asked people, drawing from work from the Reuters Institute that kind of relied on this process as well, to actually scroll through their own social media feed and walk us through their process. They told us what they were thinking as they were seeing information pop up. And what we really see is that there's a series of sort of mental cues or snap judgments that people are relying on as they're making decisions about whether something counts as news to them or not, and why. There's a couple things here. I don't want to spend too much time on it. Things like the headline. Does it note breaking? For attribution, they actually do care, despite a lot of the conversation about attribution no longer mattering in social media. People do think about it. They're making decisions about it. They look at whether it has a link. They look at whether it has a quote with a source. Visuals matter, of course, a lot to many of them. And source, I'll touch on for just a moment. This is not simply, do I trust this source, but like, do I recognize it at all? Do I notice the logo? Have I seen the logo before? Is it a verified account, which we know means a lot of different things across a lot of different social media platforms nowadays. And when we think about sources, that comprises a huge range of things. In our more recent research, where we asked about sort of the role of journalists in society today, we see that just under half of Americans say that their news mostly comes from people they think of as journalists. That's 46%. And we can see on kind of the right end of that scale, we have 32%, about a third of Americans saying that they get their news mostly from an even split of people they see as journalists and people they do not see as journalists. It's also important to note that 14% not sure. This is a very complicated question. I think, like the question of what is news, what is a journalist today is something that the public grapples with as well. They don't really know that answer. 21% of US adults are getting news from news influencers. This is when we think about that question of people who they do not think of as journalists. This may be a part of that bubble. Obviously, this is very complicated as to whether a news influencer is a journalist, not a journalist. Some of them like to call themselves journalists, others do not, so it's also dependent on the individual influencer or creator themselves. And we see with that striking amounts of adults ages 18 to 29 are getting news via news influencers. So 37% regularly getting news from influencers. The very last piece I'll touch on before we turn to the panel is sort of what are people looking for from news providers? And I think this grounds a little bit of our discussion more broadly on sort of the people who are providing this information. One of the things that we see with this is there are 3 traits that really rose to the top for Americans when we asked them, what are the traits that the people they get news from should display in their work? And we kept that very broad. We made sure we didn't use the term journalist here because we wanted to understand who, like, when you think of the person who's providing you with news and information, what is it that you think is important? Honesty, intelligence, and authenticity. And in this case, authenticity, we actually defined this as being your true self. We've seen in our qualitative work that a lot of people have mixed perspectives on what authenticity means to them. Some people don't know what authenticity means, but they know it matters. So in this case, we actually said being your true self, and we see 82% of Americans say it's important. So I'll round out that conversation. That's obviously a lot of data. We have a lot to unpack. And I will begin to turn things over to our actual panel. So just to quickly introduce everyone we have here, we have a fantastic panel with us. Thank you, panelists, for joining us. We have Nick Dawes, who's the executive editor of The City, a news outlet serving the people of New York through independent journalism. We have Joy Mayer, the founder and executive director of Trusting News, a nonprofit initiative that studies how people decide what news is and helps journalists and the public understand each other. We have Mitali Mukherjee, a director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. And we have Max Tani, who is Semaphore's media editor and co-host of the podcast Mixed Signals. So thank you, panelists, for joining us today. We'll sort of dive right in. I hope that's okay. I'm going to begin with Joy on this one, but others feel free to step in afterward. That was a lot of information. Let's try to unpack it a little bit. How do news organizations navigate an environment where what's considered news may vary so greatly depending on the preferences of their audiences? And what opportunities or challenges does this pose for them?
Thank you. Yes, lots to talk about. I think I would begin with a reminder that while the public is happy to explain to researchers what news is, as they decide what information they find credible and useful and relevant, they are not running it through a checklist of what is news. They are deciding if it is useful to them, if they can find it, if they can understand it, if it seems like it was made for them. I think that as journalists address this moment, we should be asking, is what we offer a public service? Is it accessible and useful to people? I think this is an opportunity for deep curiosity about the people we aim to serve. The answer, what is news, is not universal. If we got into small groups in this room and talked about it, we would not agree. The goal would not be coming up with one definition. And so the question of how people decide whether to rely on and give us their attention, their money, their trust, it really comes down to their personal experience with it. And I hope that we as journalists can not get so caught up in our own definition and instead just get deeply curious about people's experience with what we're providing and whether we serve the public we have, not the public we wish we had. And so are we actually serving people?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and certainly something I think we'll get into in this conversation in a little more depth. One of the things I want to focus on there is this kind of the notion of how individualized this is. We do see that kind of difference, especially when we think about the kind of concept of being personally important or societally important. I want to ask Nick here. Our research kind of shows that there's this balance struck and sometimes a tension between some of the kind of traditional norms of journalism and what people are actually looking for or interested in or say that they want. So how can news providers balance these audience preferences and this desire for increased relevance, increased personalization, alongside the sort of broader missions of the work of journalism?
Yeah, I find very troubling the suggestion that's in very wide circulation and that lots of people are building news product around, that the answer to serving people's personal or individual needs is to personalize their news and to build tools that algorithmically focus what people receive at an individual level. And even more disturbing, I think, is the idea that by interacting with a chatbot instead of a news outlet, you can have a personal experience of news that doesn't expose you to discomfort or engagement with other people. I think a lot of what we try to do in providing local coverage for New Yorkers and New York communities is to constitute a way that people can engage with something that's fundamentally public and that's about people's relationships with each other, their communities, the state, powerful private actors, in a way that nevertheless feels accessible and relevant to them at a local and individual level. So it's precisely to make that tension into a meaningful thing that guides some of the choices we make. And whether we're doing investigative reporting, our two real pillars are, on the one hand, pretty robust accountability journalism, and on the other hand, service journalism that actively sets out to help people. We try to make a connection between what happens in our accountability reporting and what we do from a service perspective. And the theory of the case we have is that if we show up in a way that's actively helpful to you, designed to be helpful to you, and that could be, how do I get my landlord to turn on the heat in my apartment, or where should I go to vote, the full spectrum from an individual problem that manifests in the domain of your rights and the law and the way the city functions, through to a very clearly civic issue, like how can I get informed about voting, that if we show up in a way that's truly helpful, then when we show up with an investigative story that, for example, looks at Eric Adams, our mayor's fundraising, and ultimately triggers an FBI investigation, the matrix of our relationship is different, and you're able to feel differently about us and our relationship with you. And just before I shut up, I thought those dimensions of authenticity and intelligence, the one you didn't get to that was also important was kindness. And when we do our investigative work, we are not kind, right? We are careful, we're intelligent, we're rigorous, I think we're authentic. In our service work, we actually try to quite carefully project something like kindness, to show up as your neighbor, not as your psychotherapist or your algorithm that's going to filter you into a place that's just for you, but in a way that is kind and helpful. And the editor in charge of that projects that incredibly powerfully to her team and on social media, and I think it enables us to set up this dynamic between the public and the personal and the helpful and the accountability-driven in a way that hopefully manages those tensions productively and makes something rich out of them.
Absolutely. And I want to touch a little bit on the point that you made at the beginning, the piece that kind of unsettles you. You mentioned chatbots. I'm curious, I'll start with Max here. Also, Mitali, I mean, I know that the work that you've been doing at the Reuters Institute around AI has been quite comprehensive in thinking about how the public is engaging with this. I am curious what exactly both of you see when it comes to, to what extent you see what news is changing or evolving with the rise of new technologies like generative AI.
Sure, I can give it a crack. I just want to check before I start speaking that people at the back can hear me. It's a bit echoey on the stage, but okay, good to hear that. Let's sort of attack it bit by bit, and let's start with this question of what is news. And I think I'd like to approach it a different way, which is the first thing that you see in generations current, and I think they're the more important ones, where we will soon be gone. But it is important what the younger generation thinks about news. So the first thing is that I think to their minds, even the word media means something completely else. For us, media tended to mean mainstream media and news organizations, but I think instantly the moment you would talk to young audiences, if you said the word media, they'd be thinking of social media platforms first, and then sort of traditional news outlets. The next thing I will say is that, and we're doing work around what is news, but I'd like to approach the question a bit differently, which is that I think if you were to break this up into areas of interest, you would still end up with what looked like a traditional newspaper. So for the person who likes sport, they'd just flip to page 17. For someone who likes entertainment, they'd be on page 11. And then someone who's, sort of a hard news consumer, if you will, and they want to know what's happening with the latest political and economic news, you'd be on page 1. Some of those dynamics remain. I think think what's changed and changed dramatically over the last decade or so is the gateway. Most people seem to, at this point in time, be accessing news via social media. More and more, the audiences that we survey, and this is across close to 50 countries, say they do not have the habit of sort of going too direct to a news website. They're coming across this on their social media feed, and that's where they're tapping or clicking to explore it further. Then you have the space where people are going direct to source. They're still looking at the same things. They're looking at what politicians have to say about policy. They're looking at what sports stars have to say about their next game. But they now have this access that they believe is absolutely direct, which is, let me go to their handle, let me go to their YouTube site, let me hear what they have to say on Instagram. And that is kind of building a direct connection, which means that the problem isn't so much, to my mind, what is news? It's how are we getting there? So the gateway has changed. It's via search as well. And now, if you opened your Google page, you would find right on top, the moment you searched for something, a generative AI kind of sampling of, where you could go with it. So all of that is changing. And to say, some of the fundamentals actually remain the same. But I think what we need to understand is how and why the value connection for audiences with mainstream media as we know it, which is your news organizations and your newspapers, has snapped. You made such an interesting point about, what is it folding back into the community? And some of our research around local news also shows that for some things like, what's the latest show? What's the weather like? People are turning to other sources. Social media is one of them where, for instance, Facebook can tell you which shows are coming up in the city you live in and when you can catch them. And I think it's that relationship that kind of has really morphed and changed and perhaps needs more exploration from a news industry's perspective. Where did we snap that connection?
Yeah, I think that's all really smart and kind of sharp stuff. I think we have a tendency as journalists and as people in the news business to be a little bit hard on ourselves, to kind of self-flagellate, to be like, oh, well, why aren't people trusting us anymore? And, these kind of things that we've been discussing and that were in discussion last night. But I think that we're a little bit too difficult on ourselves in the sense that, over the last 20 years, we've experienced this tremendous shift in the way that people get their information and in media in general. Social media has obviously played a tremendous role in this. And I think that, I think essentially the big challenges kind of that we're facing are people's habits have changed in terms of how they want to receive their news, right? It used to be the case that people would stay up and watch the evening news. They would read the newspaper in the morning, and that's what they would think of as news. Their news habits and consumptions have changed. People are getting their news in a more ambient fashion that's being fed to them on social media. And I think that that's obviously presented a lot of challenges for us in the news business, both from a financial perspective and from kind of an influence perspective. The fact is that we now have to compete with people who could be watching Netflix on their phone. And it's hard when you have a difficult to swallow piece of information, choosing between, reading a difficult article, a hard news investigation and watching your favorite movie of all time. Those are the choices that you're making. I think we're fighting an uphill battle, in that regard as journalists. But I also think it presents a lot of great opportunities as well, and I think we're going to get into that later in the panel. People still obviously have a tremendous desire for news and information. They're just open to receiving it in different ways, and I'm not as scared of personalization. I feel like as Nick is, obviously it presents a lot of different challenges, but if that's the way that people want to receive news in the future, I think it's incumbent upon us as journalists to meet them where they are, even if it is looks a little bit different than the inverted pyramid article that we learned in J school.
I'll stick with you for just a minute on that. I think one of the things, of course, that I mentioned in our presentation, and also I think just kind of comes up as a thread underlying maybe some of this conversation is the rise of people who are not journalists or even adjacent to. Maybe they are moved within and now sit without. I mean, it is a very difficult kind of categorization, but let's call them news influencers, news creators, kind of whatever you want to call them. I'm curious sort of how you see, I mean, I think the combination of what we've just talked about here in terms of new media platforms like social media, but also things like formats shaping who is providing news for the public.
Yeah, I mean, I think the audiences are telling us somewhat the answer to that, right? They're telling us, I mean, we saw in the survey data that particularly among young people, many younger people, the next generation, they'll be getting their news primarily or, in a kind of strong sense from people who are not traditionally journalists. And I think, on the one hand, obviously that presents a lot of challenges. People who are news influencers aren't held to the same editorial standards as, someone in one of our newsrooms. I can be fired if I say something wrong. A news influencer, a lot of times, you say, whoops, or you don't have to say anything at all, and you can kind of continue on your way. They might not have the same kind of ethical boundaries when it comes to, advertising or things like that. But also, we've seen that that the public is interested in connecting with individuals, and they're interested in connecting with individuals, in a variety of formats that are not, that we were not trained in necessarily as journalists. But I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that there are plenty of journalists who have been independent, who've done great work. I'll give you an example. In the United States, Pablo Torre is this fantastic sports journalist, came up at ESPN and at Sports Illustrated, set off to do his own independent podcast on sports, and has been doing the best sports investigative reporting in the United States right now. So much so that the New York Times signed him to an ad distribution deal. Basically, the New York Times signed him to a creator ad sales deal. And Pablo is not doing these sports investigations in the form of long-form articles. He's doing them around a table on YouTube for a podcast audience and for audience that's going to be clipping and sharing these types of things. On the one hand, people aren't reading it. It's not a long form investigation, but on the other, it's made a real impact on the professional leagues and on the athletes that he's covered, and I think that's really encouraging. And there's plenty of other news influencers out that are doing similar work, particularly on YouTube, that I think is exciting, even if it's not traditional and it's exists in a little bit of a murky area.
I could just add a bit on that because we've done quite a bit of research around news creators again. And the first thing to say is that I think by definition, they choose not to be put into a box. So, there is no clear definition for news creators, and it sort of varies. If you were to think of the kind of work that you see, I think it would fall into three broad boxes. One is the op-ed style. Here's what I have to say about that. And you kind of draw in an audience that agrees with that point of view. In the US, for example, most of the influencers are the top 5 or 6 are far right in terms of their content. They over-index for young men. They over-index for people who identify politically as being on the right. The second is these investigative pieces where, sort of young journalists or very young and small teams go out and do investigative pieces and reveal all on their YouTube channels or on TikTok, as the case may be. And then there's the third category of explainers. And I think this is important just to spend a minute on it because this is what's really tapping into a need that we see for young audiences. A big challenge that they face is just not having enough context. They do not understand what the news means for them. And I think in that, creators are actually beginning to play a pretty interesting role. You're absolutely right, which is that, it sort of varies so much. So let's draw a lens on India where an authoritarian regime has essentially stamped out all mainstream media, which means that the best and brightest news journalists are now on YouTube. Let's move from there to France, where Hugo Decrypt is now identified by 1/3 of our audiences as doing these really clear explainers. Let's move from there to Brazil, where someone's presenting the news essentially wearing a kind of a Bozo the Clown nose and a big wig. But, he is making a lot of sense to young people because the news is making sense through him. So I think there is that kind of that element which we really need to look at carefully. Now, having said that, it's not a one-size-fits-all. They are a little bit of a rule unto themselves, and I think by their very nature, they do not want to be, streamlined into a particular guideline or a particular expectation. But I think they're revealing something about the news, which is A, as I said, the value snap, and B, the fact that people want two things. One, they want that parasocial connection. This used to exist, I think, with television, where you kind of, immediately felt very connected to the person you saw on screen, and they feel this more and more with the creators. They feel like they know them, it's a personal friend, and they're telling them about the news or how their lives are changed. And the second thing, which I think is really important for younger generations, is this shift in terms of only vertical communication to horizontal communication. Essentially, what I mean by that is, I'm not going to take your word as the gospel truth. I'm going to check what the comments say, and I'm going to go on Reddit, and I'm going to see what other users have to say about this particular thing, and then I'll know the truth. So I think, a lot of this has changed in terms of how young people engage with the information, and that's perhaps a shift that traditional mainstream media hasn't quite got around to. I will say there's probably self-flagellation, but I think there's less self-examination, and maybe that's an important thing to be doing at this point in time.
Yeah, I'd love to turn to Nick for a moment on this. I mean, I think it's helpful, to think about some of these in the context of the local environment. We know in many contexts local news is more trusted than, for instance, national news, certainly in the U.S. context, but in many others. We know that there's sort of an opportunity, I think, to the point of parasocial relationships. We see that when people say that they've spoken to a local journalist, they're more likely to be trusting, they're more likely to engage with news. There's a range of kind of measures that maybe you would consider positive from the journalism industry around what that looks like. So I'm curious from your experiences and perspective, how do you think about both of the points that sort of Max and Mitali have made around, sort of what this means for local and how we kind of deal with it at the local level?
Yeah, I think that local offers a lot of opportunities to embrace these challenges and make them productive in ways that are much harder to achieve at a national level. At the same time, the local space is obviously increasingly invaded, sometimes literally by soldiers, by the national discourse. And so the local space is not safe from the big dynamics of polarization and rage bait and all those kinds of things. But I think that means our opportunities to work very deliberately with this dimension that Mitali outlines of horizontal and vertical relationships between people. The traditional news institution has a vertical or authority-based model for defining its trustworthiness and its relationship with its audience. It maybe lives, in the case of New York City, in a big tower on 38th Street and projects like the Eye of Sauron, from the top of that tower across the internet. I mean, who could that possibly be? The New York Times, for those of you who don't know New York geography. And a horizontal relationship or a relationship-based, we talk about authority-based and relationship-based ways of engaging. And local journalists, often are able to have more of a relationship-based context in which they engage audiences. It has to be said, lots of traditional local news organizations have combined sort of pretty bad forms of authority-based interaction with their communities with a neglect of really meaningful community interaction. And there's a huge amount of frustration with traditional local news outlets for those very reasons. Oftentimes, they have served the interests of pretty narrow sections of the towns that they dominate, and they've relied on the distribution dynamics of print, and how far you can drive a truck to assert that authority. So I think as we try to rebuild the local sector, one of the things we're trying to do is get past those dynamics and build in more direct forms of engagement with communities. To meet people where they're at is not only to show up in their social feed or their search dialogue. It's not only to live on large platforms controlled by massive tech companies. It's also to show up in a community center or at a park or an event. It's to be available to answer questions. We index heavily on tone, because how you build that relationship relies to a considerable degree on tone. So I think if you can combine very high standards of verification, the kinds of things that authority-based outlets claim to rely on, really rigorous fact-finding, very ethical approaches to right of reply, and rich sources of data and human input and policy understanding, with a willingness to engage very directly with communities who are your audience or who may become your audience, then you can have a more full understanding of how the things that make news institutions that enable them to be constitutive of a public and of a civic dialogue, rather than simply information products that are kind of in the flow, now no longer of how far the trucks can drive, but how the algorithm works. We can play a fuller democratic role, be relevant to more people. And just to give one example in closing, we do a lot of work on housing. New York City has an extreme housing crunch. It's one of the most salient things for our audiences. There are 18 million followers on TikTok of the New York City Affordable Housing Lottery hashtag, which is one of the things that made us index on it. We had a completely banal piece this April about changes to the rules, which was picked up by 2 TikTokers whom we have had no contact with whatsoever. That piece did about 250,000 unique views in one afternoon. But the compelling thing about it wasn't just drive-by traffic. 1,000 people signed up for our newsletter in the course of that afternoon. And then we were able to forge one-to-one relationships with those people that are not so mediated by platforms, to invite them to things, to introduce them to the rest of our offering, and to become their helpful neighbors. So we are far from having solved this, and we spend far too little money and far too little time in those spaces and building those connections more richly. But that's essentially the principle, combining really robust authority-based mechanisms with really meaningful relationship-based processes.
Yes. I think I would add something to the idea of meeting people where they are. I would add that we need to really understand their impressions of news and what they need from us, so that we can cut through the noise and be effective in earning their trust. I was intrigued by what Max said about, just bringing up ethics, let's say. Will a journalist tell you if they got something wrong? Well, the problem is that, of course, us in this room and the kind of journalists that people, of course I'm going to tell you if I got something wrong. Do you know a lot of people who act in the name of journalism would not? A lot of newsrooms do not have a policy around corrections. They'll change a story without adding a note saying that they got it wrong. The ethics of journalism are not universally followed. The public is who I care about the most. The public has a very hard time figuring out what is responsible journalism and what is noise, whether it is coming from somebody who presents as a traditional journalist or whether it is coming from somebody who works independently. And I think that we need to have a lot more humility and curiosity about the experience of trying to tell what is true and what is not true. And the arbiter of that is not always, do they work for a news organization? The question, I was looking back at the research you showed at the beginning, the number one quality that people said they wanted was honesty. People do not believe that we are telling them the truth. We should have so much curiosity about why that is and what it would take to persuade people that we are honest. That is not where we work, right? Although this differs demographically. Some people would find authority and connection to an organization or an institutional news organization. Some people would see that as a sign of integrity or honesty, and other people would see it as a sign of corporate control or a lack of independence. I have struck up 2 conversations here in Athens, just people next to me at the restaurant, about, I did not tell them what I do for a living. I often do not. But Canadians yesterday and Germans this morning had plenty to say about why you can't trust media. It just came up in conversation. The Canadian yesterday said he had a friend who worked for a journalism organization in the States, and he said he had to leave because he was told that he couldn't publish what he knew to be the truth. This is a middle-aged person, not a young person. I don't know where he gets his news. But there is an assumption that news organizations are squelching the truth or lying on purpose. We need to have so much curiosity about how people are deciding what is honest. For some people, it might be the authenticity, right? The trusted friend that you were talking about. Do I feel like this person? Do I have things in common with them? Can I rely on them? Do they understand where I'm coming from and what I need? But the question of what people see as honesty and what is getting in the way of them seeing me as honest is one I just wish that we as an industry would spend a lot more time asking questions about. A lot of what we do at Trusting News is about transparency. Uncover what are people's misperceptions or misassumptions about journalism, and how are you explaining it? If the investigation or the service journalism you're doing is to be valued, people need to trust your mission. They need to trust the process by which you gathered information. How do you know what you know? How are you fact-checking? What is it that you would like people to know about your information, the careful decisions you made? And how are you injecting those messages into your journalism, whether it is on TikTok, you can get a lot of wonderful journalism on TikTok, or whether it is a long-form video or long-form text piece. How are you earning trust day to day?
Just very quickly, one thing about local news, of course, is that if you want to be sure, you can just walk down the street and check or look out of the window. So there's a lot of calibration that people are able to do on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, I just want to add to this point about, what is it that the audiences seek to see in the news? Picking up from some of our data from the Digital News Report, which you were a part of only a few years ago, Kirsten. The first is, again, transparency. And then I just want to scratch on this point of transparency because it's not just the how, which I think some newsrooms are beginning to experiment with. Here's how we did this forensic investigation. It's also the why. Why are you doing this story? Who's funding you? What is behind it? I think, crudely put, people are not fools. And I think that should be the starting point of any conversation that we have about the relevance and value of news in people's lives. The other one, when we're looking at these really broad elements of polarization and misinformation, is that I think part of the rupture is the inability to point to the source of this polarization and misinformation. I mean, I didn't tell you to drink kind of toilet cleaner when COVID happened. The President of the United States told you that. And I think it's really important to keep pointing to the sources of polarization and misinformation. And the other one I will say is, I keep going back to that point Max made about self-flagellation. I don't mean to pick on it, but the thing is that mainstream media, it's not the straw weight in this equation. I think the straw weight is the people that you point to, which is people who don't have access to reliable information, who often come from poorer socioeconomic backgrounds, who don't have the educational experience to understand what a lot of this news means in their lives. And I think those are the people that we need to double down on when we think about who is the public we serve. And let me kind of, close this point with two examples. One that at the time of COVID, and this was a study done in the UK, they found that young people were increasingly not engaging with the news. There, I said it, that's the word, news avoiders. And there was two reasons for it. One, that it was affecting their mental health. And the second, that they did not feel that their life experiences were being authentically kind of represented. So what did they do? They turned to second-hand information, which means they turned to social media, they turned to hearing it from others, which immediately made it, kind of a filtered product and not the authentic information that they should be getting. That's one. And the other is on climate, which is that, so much time is spent in mainstream media talking about how large the problem is, and it's certainly large. But I think just going back to your point about what is the value for community, the best stories in terms of uptake are the ones where people know what to do about it. So it's not, it's not a story about this is what's happening with the temperature. It's a story about here's how a neighborhood got together and saved their park, and here's how you can do it. People need agency. When they turn to the news, they don't want to know how bad it is, because it is bad. And if I were to do a show of hands, I think all of us actually have a news avoidance habit. There are days,
so.
yeah, there are days we don't.
Away.
There are days we don't check the news. There are certain topics that really overwhelm us because they upset us. So what we need to do is provide people with more agency along with value.
Yeah, we can applaud that. It's always the moderator's dream for panelists to just answer questions before I've even posed them. But I think that together, I think this combination of responses really speaks to one of the things that I know our group discussed on our prep call for this, which is this question. I mean, we're talking about navigating in an age of doubt, sort of this question of what and who is news for. And I do think that this kind of speaks to the ways in which the field as a whole, I think, can better think about serving audiences that have long felt like news is perhaps not for them. I want to turn for a moment. I know we'll hit audience questions in just a moment. I want to turn for just a minute. Maybe Max, you can speak to this about authenticity. We've talked about quite a few traits that came up in our work on characteristics from people they get news from. I think that things like honesty and kindness really have kind of come up quite a bit in this conversation. I want to talk about authenticity. So, how important do you see it is? I mean, in the work that you've done in your newsrooms, in your own work, and what do you think works or doesn't work when it comes to news specifically?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously tricky because, how do you tell if somebody's being authentic? You can matrix it, you can guess, it's obviously challenging. People seem to value it, though. When you get into the specifics of what it means, it's quite a bit murkier. But I think part of it is obviously talking to people in a way that they're used to, hearing people communicate. I think it's important, I really do think it's important for us as journalists, as we've talked a lot about, to show our work and also not to be shy about pushing against the boundaries of what have traditionally been, the 20th century's rules around objectivity and things of that nature. At Semaphore, which, we're a small publication, which is where I work, we took the small step of breaking up our stories into essentially the information at the top and then the reporters or the journalist's view at the bottom. And it's a small step, but it's one that and then we'll break it up even further. We'll have a room for disagreement, and we really spell it out. Do I think that that's solving the problem of trust in media single-handedly? I wish it were, but obviously it's a little bit more complicated than that. But I do think it's an acknowledgement to the audience that me, Max, I've got a view on the topic. It allows me to express myself a little bit more, and even people who disagree with me know these are not the facts that are laid out. This is literally just kind of how I'm thinking about things. But I really think it's worth I think it's worth trying things that are not traditionally seen as maybe within the bounds of traditional journalism, and acknowledging to the audience that you are a person. As people's views of establishments kind of dim, and as people lose trust in institutions, I think it's really, really important for us as individual journalists to try to build it in as much of our work as possible. But again, I mean, so much of this, we're talking about the individual steps that we can take, and I think that it's really, really great and it's really important. But we have to acknowledge the fact that I don't think anybody here at this conference is from Google or is from Meta or from X or from TikTok. And these are the places where plenty of people are getting their news and their information. So while we are being, while I think that all of these things are valiant and they're important and we need to try a bunch of different things, I think that a big part of the problem continues to be that we don't own the pipes. And even when we're going directly through email or things like that, much of that is moderated by a tech platform, or we're using Google or we're using something else. So I think that these problems are I think that's the biggest challenge that we can kind of continue to face. And I hope that people throughout the rest of this conference are a little bit nicer to each other about why people hate us so much or whatever.
Thank you. And I have about 1 million more questions I could ask this group. I think we could go on for 2 hours. I'm not sure if the audience can, but I certainly could. I want to leave a little bit of room for audience questions. So, and I know we have a headset situation, so we'll maybe put our headsets on. Is that the correct approach? It's only if the question. Only if the question. Okay, so we'll put it on if necessary. Let's start with here, and then I'll move from there.
Hi. The problem is that these days the media landscape is more fragmented, and a lot of people are more. I would rather follow the news, see the news that are more aligned with the views, and values, rather follow nuances journalism. I personally know people who are getting the news from content creators because they see them as an establishment, relative, honest, which is not always true. Do you think it's because we, as journalists, fail to please them, the people that we are honest, or it's more like social media algorithms that cause this?
Yeah, I think you were asking, are people turning to creators because they see them as more, often they're anti-establishment? Do people see them as more honest because we haven't delivered the kind of honesty and authenticity that they can trust, or because they're algorithmically getting driven to those kinds of voices? I think that was the question.
Yeah, I want to take a little bit of a stab at it here. I think that we also, as journalists, have a harder job than a lot of creators. I mean, we'll see some really popular YouTubers or podcasters, particularly people on YouTube. I met the other day with a very popular YouTuber who's got 3 or 4 million followers, who produces 5 videos a day about kind of things that are going on in the news, and makes quite a lot of money doing it. This person is not out there reporting. They're not making calls. They're not doing the things that we traditionally count as journalism. They're relying on the work that that we are doing essentially, and kind of continuing to riff off that. So I think in some ways a lot of these people are. Our work is valuable to those kind of creators who are then taking it and able to translate that for their audience. They're freed oftentimes from the traditional journalistic values that we have in terms of objectivity and those kind of things. And so I think that honestly, I just think that creators have it a lot easier than a lot of journalists. They are able to put in less of the very, very difficult and oftentimes risky kind of work, and I think that's worth acknowledging. I think we can learn things from them by being a little bit less precious, trying things out, being on other platforms. But again, I think we deserve to give ourselves a little bit more credit. That's my line this panel.
Just want to add a little bit about the social media bit, but it's interesting. I was speaking to a news editor in India who basically referred to the community as remixers, which I thought was quite interesting. It's like they take our stuff and then they just do the thing with it and then they reproduce it. So there's obviously, it's a sore point. Just on social media, and this is, it's an odd parallel to draw, but as you know, President Trump was at the United Nations a couple of days back and made an address with some fairly odd comments popped in there, something about the geographical borders, but then when you go up with the atmosphere doesn't have the borders. The point I'm trying to get at is, it's kind of the same with social media. Social media doesn't kind of hang around there in the atmosphere above us, just doing its own thing. For all of us and our communities, social media is a reflection and a mirror of what we are as a society. So if in my country, for example, there is, majoritarian hate against a particular community, you certainly see amplification and, a very visual discourse around that on social media, but it doesn't exist in isolation. It exists because there is a large majority in my country that actually identifies with that kind of narrative and that actively practices it and propagates it. So I think it's really important as well, while talking about what we see on social media, to recognize and acknowledge with humility that these are problems and ruptures that exist within the society that we live in here and now, not just on our phones.
And just to add a tiny bit of data to, I think, a point that both of you made on this kind of concept of original reporting and kind of where that comes from. I think one of the things that we've seen in our work recently when we ask about public perceptions about just the role of journalists in society, what is a journalist to people, one of the things that comes up is that, for at least in the American context, most people will say that someone who is creating original reporting, who is finding a story, reporting on it, and putting it out to the public is a journalist. We see far smaller shares of the public say that is the case for someone who's offering commentary or aggregating information. And so I think that is a distinction people make in their minds as well as they're going through this process.
And yet they consume it. Right? They are not saying, is this journalism, is this not journalism? They consume commentary and analysis and opinion at very high levels. And the same is true for a columnist at the New York Times, that they are relying on the original reporting of their colleagues perhaps, other journalists perhaps, but their job is sense-making. And that is one thing the public is very hungry for. Help me make sense of what is happening. And whether that is an opinion columnist paid by a newspaper or someone on YouTube, they're hungry for it.
Yeah. Let's have a question in the back, very back. Yep.
Hi. Thanks so much for this great talk. My name is Zach Toombs. I'm with Evident Media. You've talked a lot about spontaneously how we're working with these online content creators and news influencers. But what about the organizations that are trying to actively create partnerships and relationships with those creators? I mean, we have the big ones like the New York Times. Max mentioned that initiative. Our organization is very small. We're doing some of this. What do you see as the potential opportunity, but also the pitfalls of those relationships?
I can take that. We do some of this. Firstly, I would say you should listen to Max's podcast conversation with Pablo on their podcast, Mixed Signals. It's a really interesting look at how that happens at kind of enterprise scale, right? And he's super interesting on how he made that journey. So anyway, a plug for Max.
Thank you for the plug, Nick. Really appreciate it.
I think we are all underinvested and overcautious in building these kinds of collaborations. Sometimes they happen to us spontaneously. The case I mentioned about the housing lottery was a totally spontaneous thing, but we have then used the results of it to inform some choices about coverage that we're making because it was so successful, and we want to lean into that. But we've started to do some small experiments in working with local creators and influencers who are paid, and getting comfortable with the idea that this is how people make their living on these platforms, and that it's not unethical for us to actually make a deal with them, to pay them and to have them help us with distribution. There are some who are happy to be paid in the form of, oh, this partnership gives me content that I need and enables me to boost my own effectiveness. But there are others for whom a relatively modest payment is a meaningful part of their income. So we try to be thoughtful about people who we've seen consistently doing work that aligns with our values and that reaches the kind of people whom we want to reach. And what we've seen from those partnerships, and we're not talking about huge accounts with hundreds of thousands or millions of followers. We're talking about people with local influence, tens of thousands of followers. And what we've seen from those collaborations is that both the creator and the city have experienced significant reach beyond their usual audiences. So we've done a bunch of election stuff with a young creator who goes by Pigeon Post, does a lot of the explainer kind of category on your typology. And the engagement that we got on those posts was like 5x Pigeon Post's usual and about 10x our usual. And not only 10x our usual, but 70% from people who had never engaged with us before. Where I would like to take that is to actually build out a program for building those relationships, have an editor responsible for those relationships, and really make it a core part of our distribution methodology so that we become a place where core fact-finding happens and where we focus on building one-to-one relationships, maybe not free of platform mediation, but with less platform mediation. And then we have a whole network of people whom we've partnered with and engaged with. So I think we're at the very early stages of experimenting with it, but much more than building our own TikTok newsroom, I think investment in doing that could be enormously huge leverage for us.
One of my colleagues has put together a checklist for newsrooms for creator partnerships and collaborations, kind of a red, yellow, green. Is this person a good fit for me with mission, with ethics? What are the pitfalls and concerns? So if you want to find me after, I'm happy to share that link.
Can I say just one thing really, really quickly? I mean, we already see this a lot in the podcast world. If you look at what Vox Media has done over the last several years, they basically built out a whole podcast ad network, that is essentially it's mostly for their chat shows, but there is a lot of real journalism and real information kind of undergirding a lot of that stuff. And I think that there's a page that journalism could take from something like that. And I do think it's a good model for supporting. They're using the podcast revenues both to build up their podcast business, which I think is really, really quality and is putting mostly very, very good information out into the world, and also to kind of help their journalism as well. And it brings journalists and personalities into Vox and to New York Magazine, and kind of who might not otherwise be willing to take on like an editor or a staffer role or whatnot, and kind of makes them a part of that process. I think it's really innovative, and I think it's really interesting as well.
All right, I think we have time for one last question. This will have to be a bit succinct, both on their end and our end, so a high bar for this. Let's go right here.
Thank you for this really interesting panel. My name is Judith Kösters. I work for ARD, so German public broadcaster. And all of what you said is, of course, relevant to what I do, what we do, to our work. But at the same time, in many countries in Europe, the situation is really different to the US. And so I'm wondering what this all means for a public broadcaster that has, I think, 7 billion euros budget per year, that really is still trusted even by big parts of the young population. And this whole, the tubes, I feel really bad making content for tubes that are not ours with public money. That feels really wrong. And is there a chance that that you don't have, but we have, and what is it, and how can we use it?
I can take that really quickly. So, and thank you for raising that, because it's a hugely important point. I think much of our research has pointed to the fact that in countries where there is robust public service broadcasting, across the board, populations there feel more aware, they have higher trust, and they feel better informed. For all its faults, the BBC is still the most trusted in the UK, and people turn to it because of the reliability of information that they have, and the fact that it's quite democratic in terms of its access. I think, quite honestly, countries that do not have that suffer from it, and it's really, really important to think about serving the public in that role of being a public service broadcaster. I think the second part of your question was about, what you should be doing in terms of innovation. And I will say, just kind of picking up on the same points, which is that with every platform, there is risk. But with every platform, you have to acknowledge that there is opportunity. So I think you have to be really clear-eyed about the fact that, is there opportunity there, A, and B, is that where my audience is at? So is that a space that I need to inhabit? What's the best way for me to be there? What's the best way for me to connect with them? The audience will no longer come to us where we're sat with, kind of the best information that we have. So I think we have to make that journey if we want to, and that is our role, to serve the public, try and meet them where they are.
I want to offer a huge thank you to our panelists. Truly, this is a fantastic discussion. We are so appreciative.
Thank you, Kirsten, for moderating it.
Oh, of course, yes. Thank you for joining us, everyone.